Welcome back to Disturbed Reality. Of course, as most of you have guessed, I have a fascination with the macabre, and of course, true crime scratches that itch, where we can take a glimpse into the mind of a violent psychopath, all from the comfort of our own headphones. Of course, the internet is inundated with podcasts and episodes dedicated to the most violent serial killers of mainly the 20th century. Names such as Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy are most true crime fans' introduction into the genre, and while the stories of those two monsters are interesting, they have been done to death, so to speak, as have discussions on the serial killer boom from the 1970s to the 1980s in the USA and to a lesser extent the UK. However, I have a peculiar fascination with serial killers from the Soviet Union, mainly from the 70s to the early 90s. The Soviet Union and the West were culturally worlds apart, one side practicing capitalism with virtues of freedom of speech and expression, whereas the other practiced communism, espousing virtues such as class solidarity and viewing the West in general as exploitative and evil. The political bias of the Soviet Union was naturally strong during the Cold War era. Anything deemed as Western was viewed as evil, and that it couldn't possibly happen in the Soviet Union, including the concept of serial killers. The reality was, however, the Soviet Union over the years had various serial killers who racked up high body counts, but the concept of a serial killer was deemed Western. As a result, police in various oblasts would often play down the work of serial killers, writing them off as individual murders, and very often refusing to investigate such murders properly. As a result, certain killers were able to maintain a long and bloody reign of terror. Considering the political differences between the Soviet Union and the West at the time, I find it particularly interesting that both had a serial killer problem. The conspiracy theorist in me loves to theorize as to why that was. Was it the result of secret human experimentation programs, for example MK Ultra, which was conducted by the CIA, primarily from the 1950s to the 1960s, or was it something else? One theory is that a collective trauma following World War II essentially forged serial killers. Young children being raised by World War II veterans, both across the Soviet Union as well as in the UK and the USA, is a possible reason as to why the 60s, 70s and 80s saw so many serial killers and mass murderers. However, that isn't the topic of today's video. Today, we are discussing the brutal life of Aleksey Sukletin, a Russian serial killer who went by various nicknames such as the Volga Alligator, the Kazan Ogre, and the Vasilyevich Cannibal. Aleksey Sukletin was born in 1943 in Kazan, a city in southwest Russia on the banks of the Volga and Kazanka rivers. Not too much is known about Aleksey's early life. However, his mother worked as a nurse in a military field hospital. There is no information available on Aleksey's father, or whether he was in his life. All we really know is that Aleksey seemingly grew up in a poor environment and began drinking during his early teenage years, and this habit would follow him throughout his adolescence and into his adulthood. Aleksey's first known crime occurred when he was 16 years old, during February of 1960. On a cold, bleak night, Aleksey prowled the streets of Kazan, where he spotted a young girl. Aleksey proceeded to stalk her, before smashing her on the head with a heavy object, and then attempted to rape her. However, before Aleksey could fully act out his savagery, two other men stumbled upon the scene and saved the young girl. Aleksey fled the scene, however, he was later arrested for his crime. Sukletin was sentenced to 2 years in prison, serving his punishment in a youth detention center, and upon reaching maturity, he was transferred to a corrective labor colony. Aleksey's time in prison did little to change his behaviour, and upon getting out, he once again hit the bottle, though for a couple of years he managed to keep his violent tendencies under control. That was until 1964. In 1964, Sukletin committed a new crime, acting together with accomplices who he was out drinking with. Once they had no more money left to spend on booze, Sukletin informed them of an elderly woman who lived nearby alone. They entered her apartment together, posing as gas service employees. The men then hit the woman on the head with a heavy object and took 80 rubles. but the victim survived and reported the crime to the police. The attackers were detained just a few hours later at a nearby bar. Aleksey Sukletin was subsequently sentenced to a long stretch behind bars, 12 years to be exact. While serving his sentence, he collaborated with law enforcement agencies, telling them about each of his convictions, and he was seen as a good prisoner. Whilst in prison, Aleksey also became a key reader, reading books on human psychology, among other similar subjects, though he didn't use this for good or to better himself. Instead, he used the knowledge he gained to seduce women once he left prison. In 1976, Sukletin was released after he completed his 12-year sentence. Once released, he got a job as a worker for an insurance company, though this role didn't work out, and he was fired for not turning up to various shifts. A similar pattern occurred when he got a job for a horticultural association. Again, he was fired for frequent absences. In 1978, he had a brief stint working in a psychiatric hospital, and a year later, he changed jobs again, becoming a security guard in the garden community in the urban settlement of Vasilyevo. The same year, Aleksey Sukletin met 23-year-old Medina Shakirova, a native of Vasilyevo, and began living with her. Before meeting Sukletin, Shakirova had gone to Uzbekistan for work, and then moved to Kazan, where she worked as a turner at a plant, and then as a farm worker. She also had a child which she abandoned and gave to her parents, while she herself moved in with Sukletin. While stating, in an attempt to impress Medina, Sukletin told her that he was supposed to be serving a prison sentence at a Kazakhstan camp, but fled, leading her to believe that he was a fugitive. The pair were seemingly meant for each other, and soon the couple began to engage in criminal activities, starting with extortion. Under the instruction of Sukletin, Shakirova went from Vasilyevo to Kazan, taking a taxi back late in the evening. She complained to the taxi driver that her husband was cheating on her, and when they arrived at Sukletin's home, she offered the taxi driver to spend the night together. The man agreed, and then Sukletin, along with his accomplice Rinat Volkov, who both played the role of a jealous husband and Shakirova's brother, burst into the bedroom. They beat up the taxi driver and demanded money from him, also photographing him in indecent postures. They asked for 200 rubles, or else they would distribute the pictures to the public. The next day, the taxi driver gave them 200 rubles. Early on in Aleksey's and Medina's relationship, Aleksey confessed his deepest, darkest desires. He informed Medina that he wanted to murder a woman in order to eat her flesh. He cited Vazim Bedel Bokassa, the emperor of the Central African Empire, as his idol, who also committed cannibalism, and also admired Jack the Ripper. He would discuss these two figures with his girlfriend at length. It's believed he read about them whilst in prison. Now, there is a debate as to when and who Sukletin's first murder was, but it's believed to have occurred in November of 1979. He invited 22-year-old Ekterina Ostorova, allegedly a prostitute, to his home, introducing Shakirova as his sister. A feast took place and drinks were enjoyed, and then Sukletin and Ostorova went to the bedroom and had sex. Shakirova then offered Ostorova a drink, distracting her, while Sukletin took a rag-wrapped hammer and cracked her on the head with it. Sukletin then put her in an animal trough, tied her hands with a rope, and then cut her throat with a knife. He claimed to have drunk her blood while she was still alive, and made Shakirova drink with him. When Ostorova died, he hung her corpse and mocked her, before then cutting off the soft tissues and removing the internal organs, all with Shakirova's help. The remaining blood was disposed of in the bath. Sukletin then ate her heart, liver and lungs in an assortment of different cooked dishes. Medina Shakirova prepared borscht and pelmeni from the remains, which she ate together with Sukletin. Due to the excessive amount of flesh to get rid of, the pair even fed some of the remains to their dogs. The couple buried the victims' bones under a water tower. Sukletin would go on to murder all of his victims in a similar way, striking them by surprise with a hammer before usually cutting their throats. After the death of the victims, Sukletin and Shakirova dismembered the corpses and ate the soft tissues. Shakirova would then wash the bloody clothes and even Sukletin's underwear. She did not take part in the killings directly, but she did help in setting up the murders and helping with the aftermaths. Most of the bones of all of the subsequent victims were buried in the same place as those of Ekaterina Ostarova. Sometimes, Shakarova would keep items from the victims for herself. In addition to eating the human meat, Sukletin and Shakarova sold it to their neighbours under the guise of being pork tenderloin. According to the head of the investigative unit of the Tatarstan Prosecutor's Office, Farid Zagadulin, Sukletin's adult victims were sex workers, vagrants or alcoholics. Subsequently, Medina Shakarova recalled that Sukletin looked at women only as possible sources of meat. Allegedly, Sukletin had tried to kill her 3 times. She also said beautiful women often caused him to be really malicious, and those who were intelligent he was afraid of. He liked to talk and dream about such people as me, how he would have sexual intercourse with her, and always in a perverted form, and then he would kill and eat them. In January of 1980, Sukletin committed his second murder. Together with Shakarova, he met 2 girls and invited them to celebrate New Year. At night, he killed and ate one of the girls, that being 22-year-old Tatiana Ilarianova. He didn't harm the second girl, as according to him, she seemed too thin for his liking. When the surviving girl woke up, Sukletin told her that Tatiana got up early in the morning and went to Kazan. The third victim of the killer was 15-year-old Rozada Galimova. Sukletin lured the girl to his dacha, saying that he would settle her problems with studies, offering to help her revise. He then raped her, and he killed her with 2 hammer blows to the head, cracking her skull open. The victim begged Shakarova to help her, but she refused. Subsequently, Shakarova then took the girl's sweater as her own. After killing Galimova, Sukletin lured 22-year-old Nadezhda Sityavina to his house. Initially, it did not appear that Sukletin was going to kill Sityavina. He even said to Medina that Sityavina was going to live with them. He even presented the 22-year-old to his own mother. However, he killed her shortly after. The 5th victim was 19-year-old Natalia Shkolnikova, a colleague of Sityavina. Not too much else is known about this murder. The 6th and youngest victim of Sukletin was 11-year-old Alentina Elikova. Having met the girl in Kazan, the killer introduced himself as a distant uncle and took her to his home. He then hit Elikova's head against the wall, killed and then ate her. During the murder, Medina Shakarova actually tried to save the girl. However, she was overpowered by Sukletin and was severely beaten. After the murder, Aleksey Sukletin's desires grew even more dark. He instructed Shakarova to kidnap him a baby girl for him to eat, but she refused and left Sukletin. Despite being a monster and an enabler herself, this was too far even for Medina. Despite leaving Aleksey, she didn't tell anyone of his crimes. After Shakarova left, Sukletin then raped the juvenile daughter of his friend Boris. He did this by telling her about a non-existent nephew living in Italy, for whom he promised to find a girl to marry. Soon after, 23-year-old Lydia Fyodorova moved in with Aleksey. Lydia was struggling with alcohol abuse at the time. She was often accompanied by her relative Anatoly Nikitin. The 3 of them had parties and drank alcohol together. During Aleksey's and Lydia's short relationship, Aleksey constantly plied her with booze, aiming to use her to replace Medina as someone who could lure potential victims to his home. Aleksey confessed his desires and his demands, but Lydia outright refused. In fact, Lydia threatened to expose Aleksey. On the 12th of March 1985, Aleksey Sukletin flew into a rage following Lydia's refusal. He beat her, and then murdered her. Sukletin burnt her clothes, and after mocking her corpse, he then dismembered it and ate the soft tissues. On the 18th of March, Shakarova returned to Sukletin. In order to conceal the murder, she washed the bloodied clothes and cleaned signs of a murder. According to neighbours, Aleksey Sukletin did not arouse any suspicion in them. They knew him as a good man and a good drinking companion, who could fix a roof, dig potatoes, recite poems, and was a hospitable host. He was seen as a womanizer, but not a dangerous person by his neighbours. In hindsight, some of Sukletin's behaviours and comments were off, however, and like many psychopaths, Aleksey seemed to engage in a phenomenon known as duper's delight. Very often, psychopaths get off on misleading people. For example, one neighbour recited how Sukletin would often refer to local children as little meatballs. This was Sukletin's way of essentially confessing without confessing. The Vasilyevo police eventually visited Sukletin, but failed to gather any evidence. In mid-80s Soviet society, it was not customary to talk about serial killers, which were considered a characteristic feature of capitalist countries, as a result of which law enforcement agencies kept the disappearances of women and girls in Vasilyevo a secret. Eventually, Lydia Fyodorova's disappearance came too much for the police to ignore, and then police visited the residence of Sukletin and asked him questions about her whereabouts, though he denied any knowledge. Shortly after Lydia's murder, Sukletin visited Gennady Uglov, a co-worker with whom he drank alcohol with. When Uglov quizzed Sukletin on where Lydia was, the maniac showed him the burial site of her remains. Sukletin thought Gennady wouldn't tell authorities, as he himself had dirt on Gennady. Sukletin believed that Uglov would not disclose what he knew about Lydia's murder because Sukletin, in his position as a guard, had promised to make an entry in Uglov's workbook which would allow Gennady to avoid criminal liability for pollution that led to disease. However, on the 3rd of June 1985, Gennady Uglov filed a report with the police. Initially, the police force did not believe him, but Uglov then told the story to a friend who worked at the police force. Eventually, the authorities once again paid a visit to Aleksey Sukletin and searched his property, and on the search, they found the passport of one of the victims, as well as some remains of another. On the 4th of June 1985, Aleksey Sukletin was finally arrested. Former Olympic weightlifting champion Nikolai Koloshnikov, who was then a senior security officer in the Tatastan's Criminal Investigation Department for particularly important cases, participated in the maniac's capture. 4 bags of human bones were collected from Sukletin's garden, and half a bucket of melted human fat was found in a utility room. Subsequently, his accomplices Shakarova, Nikitin and Volkov were also arrested. During the first interrogations, Sukletin stated that investigators would not be able to prove his guilt in the murders, and he gave the image of a confident and cocky defendant. However, the evidence was mounting against him. An investigator managed to obtain a confession from Shakarova, threatening that she would be executed if she stayed silent. Frightened that her daughter would be orphaned, she began to testify, writing 70 sheets of text incriminating Aleksey. In her testimony, she stated, "I myself did not kill anyone. He cut the meat, cooked the food from the dead. We appropriated some things from the dead, coats, skirts, jackets, shoes and books. I took only good things, the bad we burned." Sukletin was transferred to Moscow for a forensic psychiatric examination, where he tried to feign insanity. During his examinations, he showed no signs of remorse for the murders, stating, "Why should I repent? They were all prostitutes. I helped society. I cleaned it. Say, from the immoral element. No, I don't regret them." When Sukletin was asked whether he was afraid of God and the Last Judgment, he replied, "Ha, what is God to me? Myself, I am God, and the devil. I'm actually afraid of death. I am reluctant to die now. I have lived only a little yet. Spare me with your Last Judgment." According to the results of the examination, Sukletin was recognized as sane, despite his attempts to fake madness. Trying to buy more time, Aleksey then confessed to crimes that he never even committed, though authorities saw through this attempt. When asked to help find remains of the victims, Aleksey demanded he be paid 50 rubles per victim that he led authorities to find. He would also be disruptive in court, very often interrupting hearings in order to smoke. When recounting his crimes during interviews with authorities, it said that Aleksey did this with glee and with a smile on his face, reminiscing about his times of brutality. On April 18, 1986, Aleksey Sukletin was sentenced to execution via firing squad. While awaiting execution, the maniac carved women's shoes from bread and presented them to the lead investigator, Farid Zagadulin. On the 29th of July, 1987, the execution was carried out, marking an end to Aleksey's reign of terror. For Medina Shakarova, the prosecution also requested the death penalty. However, the court took into account mitigating factors, such as the defendant's repentance of the crimes committed, as well as the fact that she participated in criminal activity under the threat of murder by Sukletin. She was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. Anatoly Nikitin was also sentenced to 15 years for the murder of Lydia Fyodorova, and Rinat Volkov was sentenced to 7 years for extortion. While in prison due to the shocking nature of her crimes, Medina Shakarova didn't have an easy time. She was often assaulted and was shunned by the other prisoners. She was given the nickname Medina Meat Grinder. In 2001, Medina was released from prison and eventually gave an interview to Russian TV in 2008. That was the case of the Kazan ogre, Aleksey Sukletin. It's also worth noting that there are some photographs of the remains found of some of the victims, all of which are very graphic and disturbing. Just for an example, one photo shows a decomposing severed head, and another appears to show huge chunks of rotting flesh and skin. But anyway, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it, if you can enjoy this sort of content. Something a little bit different. I do have a fascination with Soviet-era serial killers, so if anyone out there has any recommendations, please feel free to let me know. But as always, stay safe, and I'll catch you on the next one.